Okay, some of you felt I might have cheated a little in the last video, and I probably did. But I firmly believe that there are some things going on that sound more like conspiracy theories than reality. As Mel Gibson pointed out in the movie of the same title, the thing that makes a conspiracy theory a good one is the inability to prove that it's true. So for those saying that I wimped out, here's something that's easier to prove true. You can look up everything here and do the math yourself. As I stated in my first video, for quite a while now, some of us have noticed that some things just don't make sense. Something doesn't feel right. It's like the Sesame Street game. One of these things is not like the others, but in real life. We know something's off, but what exactly? If you look at our country, the way it's presented on the news, it appears to be a bunch of separate but chaotic news stories. It's easy to overlook the big picture, or in fact wonder if a big picture actually exists. For months, I've tried to lay it all out, get it straight in my own mind. Politics, identity groups, Antifa, the alt-right, Black Lives Matter, Hollywood, the NFL, and it all just seems like confusion at best. Is there any kind of relationship between Michael Brown and Colin Kaepernick, or between the lunatic ravings of Maxine Waters and Nancy Pelosi's declaration that we have to pass the bill so we can see what's in it? And if it really is all related, then who's pulling the strings? The answer, unfortunately, is just as complicated as the question, and it has to do with values and what shapes our lives. I find it amazing that in the first short months, in the few short months since I produced this first video, the term socialism has moved out into the open. I thought I was doing some kind of big reveal and everyone would gasp and say, "No way!" Maybe I'd win some kind of award for investigative journaling. Instead, my first few videos seem to be irrelevant simply because the light is starting to shine on the issues we're facing. But what in Sam Hill went wrong? How could this happen here in the United States, one of the greatest countries that's ever existed? Of course, I realize that putting the word democratic in front of socialism does make it all better. And you better realize that I'm being sarcastic. But really, it's like we were brainwashed or something. That may not be far from the truth. The events occurring in our country today find their roots going all the way back into the 1800s. But they grew out of a particular way of thinking, a philosophy that solidified in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. This philosophy, known as critical theory, was centered in a group of professors that represented Germany's best and brightest at the University of Frankfurt. This group later came to be known less formally as the Frankfurt School. Critical theory is a critique of culture and society. It finds its origins in the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the mid-1800s, but it took its shape in the Frankfurt School in the 1920s and 30s. It found itself blended with Western Marxism in the aftermath of the October Revolution of 1917. Although the term Western Marxism itself wasn't coined until 1953, this strain of thought came out of Central and Western Europe and focused more on the philosophical and social aspects of Marxism instead of the economic and revolutionary aspects. To say it a little better, people looked at Russia and the October Revolution in 1917 and they decided that Russia's form of Marxism was a little too bloody, and they decided to take a step back. The emphasis began to focus on reformation instead of revolution. You'll hear those terms again. If we could use an analogy of a family tree, critical theory and Western Marxism represent the parents, with Karl Marx as the patriarch grandfather. There are various forms of socialism and Marxism that could be aunts and uncles, but we will confine this conversation to a single family line. We'll see branches emerge as we get to the children and grandchildren. Prominent members of the Frankfurt School brought with them a number of disciplines, including the liberal arts, Darwinian evolution, and Freudian psychoanalysis. The last two in particular gave a certain authenticity to the group, as opposed to the more speculative and abstract atmosphere of philosophy alone. This toxic blend of philosophy, speculative science, and Marxist disdain for authority led to a question everything mentality. The rise of cultural studies by British academics in the 1960s can be clearly seen as an outgrowth to this approach. What is interesting is the co-opting of the term science to legitimate a discipline that has very little science about it. The use of the scientific method with its ability to observe recordable and repeatable results is nowhere to be found among the social or political sciences. Ironically, the Marxist-influenced Frankfurt School found itself pushed out of Frankfurt by the socialist-influenced Adolf Hitler. Hitler's own party, the Nationalist Socialists, or Nazis, shared its roots with the socialist philosophy, but his insane desire to purge the Third Reich of Jews trumped any philosophical or societal beliefs he may have had in common with any of the members of the Frankfurt School. Themselves being Jews, most of them fled to Switzerland and later the United States as refugees. Because the enemy of my enemy must be my friend, this bunch of nutty professors found acceptance, even open arms, within the American academic world. Members included music critic Theodor Adorno, sex theorist Wilhelm Reich, psychologist Erich Fromm, philosophers Walter Benjamin and Max Horkheimer, and even a British-Russian double agent, Richard Sorge. The greatest political influence in the United States, however, was Herbert Marcuse, later known as the father of the New Left in the 1960s. If we continue to use the family tree analogy, the New Left certainly represents the favorite child. Marcuse wrote, "Since all questions of material existence have been solved, moral commands and prohibitions are no longer relevant." Remember that quote, we'll come back to it. Marcuse himself regarded the true liberation of humanity as the realization of its erotic nature. The Freudian obsession with sex, not only by Marcuse but also by other members of the Frankfurt School, directly translates into the sexual revolution of the 60s, followed by what can properly be termed as the sexual rebellion of the next 50 years. To me, it is interesting to look at the sexual dimensions of most of the Reformation movements since the 60s. Feminism, gay rights, abortion, gender roles, all of these movements emphasize sex and sexuality in a way that they would describe as liberating or stretching the boundaries. But stretching the boundaries often means going well beyond the boundaries. Ultimately, these movements all seek the same reformation, namely the removal of the traditional roles and reforming the two-parent nuclear family. No one seriously believes anymore that these movements are about rights of inclusion, whether race or gender or anything else. Both sides know it, you know it, I know it. If anything, it's all about exclusion. And the entity that must be excluded far above anything else is the two-parent nuclear family. I don't mean nuclear family as in one that grew up in the nuclear age. I mean a family that is tightly knit as a nucleus, depending on its members for encouragement and support. Two parents raising obedient, respectful kids who hope to be parents and raise kids themselves one day. Think about it. What is the physical evidence that speaks loudest in favor of an established order? What was it that God Himself gave us in the Garden of Eden as the pattern for relationships for all of history to come? The two-parent nuclear family. And if the two-parent nuclear family is the established norm, then what stands in comparison? Single-parent families, families with same-sex parents, and so on. So the two-parent nuclear family must be obliterated so that the other types don't feel judged. Holy Spirit conviction has been replaced today by judgment. In the old days, conviction gave us the opportunity to change for the better. Today, judgment gives us the resistance to change so that we can stay the same. Judge not are the only two biblical words quoted with consistency in this present generation. Anyway, if you're looking to legitimate any form of sexual deviance, you have to destroy, obliterate the two-parent nuclear family because it stands as evidence against everything else. It's almost as if the left is saying, how dare you have a happy childhood? How dare you have a happy family life? How dare you have a healthy relationship with your spouse? And in some cases, how dare you have a spouse, especially a spouse you've had for most of your life? The war on family had begun. We'll talk more in a few minutes as to how this war is being fought. The New Left found itself propelled along during the 60s decade by a number of issues. It strongly embraced and encouraged Latin resistance to American colonization, a sentiment that continues to be felt as today's left resists a controlled border and welcomes immigration without question. You thought that was something new. The New Left also found a home on college and university campuses. C. Wright Mills, a sociology professor at Columbia University in New York, wrote what he called an open letter to the New Left, published in the September-October issue of New Left Review in 1960. In this letter, he encouraged students to embrace an international scope and a global outlook. The fight against post-World War II nationalism had begun. The core of the New Left was a group that called themselves Students for a Democratic Society. Organized in 1962, they embraced the free speech movement and called for a rejection of the establishment. The critical theory parents, with their question everything mentality, would have been so proud of their student children taking up the cause. The Marxist hatred of authority, combined with the Frankfurt School question everything and reject establishment mentality, and its obsession with sex, laid the groundwork for an all-out war on the American society. Our nation, with its newfound prosperity of the 50s, its tail-finned cars and television sets, enjoyed driving down the new interstate system and listening to the new music of Buddy Holly and Bill Haley and his Comets, never dreaming that it, as a nation, was growing a cancer inside itself worse than any that might be caused by the Marlboro Man and his horse. Question everything and reject the establishment. Who would have thought that the United States culture, based on centuries of established values, came to us via the Judeo-Christian faiths, Greco-Roman civilization of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the conservative impulse of the Thomistic Middle Ages, the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras? Who would have thought that this would be what gave birth to the resentful philosophy of the Marxist socialists, the First World War socialist revolutions, and the Cold War with its proclamation of the end of history? And who would have thought, as they watched the white hats win over the black hats, as they affirmed that Father knows best, and as they gleaned the wisdom of Ward Cleaver, that the prize in this unholy battle would be the American family and what used to be called family values? It doesn't end there. Even though the idea was reforming instead of revolution, only the complete destruction of the existing framework would be sufficient to allow the new groundwork for a socialist society to be laid. The United States, melting pot, e pluribus unum, one nation under God, indivisible, had to be divided and then destroyed, and the only way to do that was from within. Only a multi-pronged approach could move fast enough and do enough damage and provide a crippling blow to the national value system. One prong was to divide races, fragment the country into as many hyphens as possible. African American, Hispanic American, Irish American, Native American. Focus on the differences, then create a false diversity, a false sense of inequality. Sow seeds of resentment while giving each ethnicity its own history month. Destroy the black race from without through Social Security and the war on poverty, as well as from within by abortion, subsidizing single parenthood, and pushing blacks into ghettos that resemble Nazi Warsaw. Another prong was to divide genders. The women's rights movement led to the feminist movement. The so-called battle of the sexes became a focal point of television game shows, and divorce was in vogue during the 70s. In fact, much of the 70s, 80s, and 90s was spent normalizing the divorced and single again lifestyles. The Students for a Democratic Society dissolved in 1969. Essentially, the socialist protest of the 60s divided into two factions. Students who wanted reformation from within moved into politics, forming coalitions and fighting for equal rights. Political and cultural activities worked to call attention to the injustices found within identity politics, environmental politics, animal rights, and so on. Those who felt reformation was too slow favored revolutionary measures. Anarchist groups such as the Black Panthers, the Weathermen, and a host of others formed to battle the issues in a more decisive, overt form. A new breed of activists formed during this time, activists who believed that the pen was mightier than the sword. News reporters became journalists who weren't as interested in reporting the news in our neighborhoods as much as they were in giving us investigative reporting. Interpreting the news became just as important, and then more so, as reporting it. Other activists gained an even wider audience for their messages, becoming screenwriters and actors in Hollywood. The big screen became a soapbox for those who mounted and maintained a continuous assault against the value system that had put them there in the first place. The next 40 years would see a continuous onslaught of television episodes that portrayed the father as an angry, raving, totalitarian lunatic, or a complete bumbling idiot. Fathers and mothers were portrayed as stupid and completely inept, constantly having to be saved by the kids, the only ones who really knew what was going on and how to fix it. On the big screen, we saw Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Footloose, and Smokey and the Bandit. While on the small screen, we watched The Simpsons and the South Park Gang. All of these were funny, and we all laughed. But each one, when taken out of context, was totally unbelievable. Would you really be a proud parent of Ferris Bueller, or a happy neighbor of Burt Reynolds as the Bandit? And while we all enjoyed seeing Buford T. Justice get his own brand of justice handed to him by the Bandit and the Snowman, if a truck driver and his hot rod driving partner were to actually cause that much damage and threaten that many lives from Texas to Georgia, we would all overwhelmingly be calling for their arrest and prosecution. Would you want your children driving on the same highway as the Bandit and the Snowman? Even everyone's favorite friends aren't so friendly. Would anyone really claim as their best friend someone whose every comment is a snarky, sarcastic response? Does anybody who decries misogyny know an airheaded playboy who bags as many women as he wants and never grows up? How about being best friends with an over-controlling, overbearing shrew whose goal in life is to get everyone else's life cleaned up but her own? How about a doctor who's always insecure and double-minded but doesn't want to be the 3 times divorced guy? Does anyone really believe that living on the streets actually leaves you pretty, having no scars or lasting effects? Or how about the pretty one who gets through life depending on her looks and sabotages her ex's chances at happiness at every turn through every season? My suspicion is that none of us want best friends like this, and yet we watched for how many seasons, and we continue to turn on the syndicated reruns every chance we get. Ward Cleaver, Ricky Ricardo, and Howard Cunningham never knew what hit them. It's always been odd to me how we put the opinions of actors, singers, and sports figures on a par with the experts. But Hollywood has to maintain an illusion of relevance so it can keep up the process of changing its narrative. The capitalist machine that generates billions of dollars tries to convince us that they are just like the rest of us. It's a sleight of hand trying to convince us that the guilty 1% is somehow different from the Hollywood 1%. The great paradox faced by Hollywood is how to keep quiet the fact that even as it becomes more left-leaning and more socialist preaching, the money that sustains its platform comes from the capitalist structure that keeps fans returning to the theaters for more. Entertainment venues such as Disney and Universal Studios thrive on the capitalist markets, decried by their employed entertainers. And the entertainment venues worth billions of dollars pale in comparison to the money generated by toys and accessories made popular by the movies themselves. Anti-gun advocate Matt Damon would have pennies on the dollar if not for his alter ego, Jason Bourne, who would not exist at all without, you guessed it, his trusty firearms. Maybe a word directly from God explaining it all would help, but in his absence, Morgan Freeman will suffice. Ironically, the socialist message preached by Hollywood actors and screenwriters was only made possible by the capitalist economy that put a television set in every American home during the previous generation. To return to the family tree of the critical theorists, the grandkids are in full control of the family fortune today. The anarchist groups of the 60s find themselves reshaped and reborn in Black Lives Matter, Antifa, PETA, and a host of others who fight the battle. The reformers are present also, leading the battle of identity politics as journalists for the mainstream media and professors and teachers at every level of education, beginning with universities and colleges and going all the way down to the youngest K3 and K4 classroom in the local school. Politicians campaign on and win using issues related to all of these matters we've discussed, and they become richer in the process. I don't recall ever of hearing of a politician leaving Washington, D.C. in worse shape financially than when they came. Oh, except for Bill and Hillary Clinton, who supposedly left there broke. I wonder if they were able to maybe find a charitable foundation. They could have asked for help. But whether it's reform or revolution, the sentiment is best expressed in the title of Hillary Clinton's thesis written to complete her bachelor's degree. There is only the fight. It affirms what some of us have come to believe. Anything that continues the fight against American values and the American family is fair game. The subject of her paper is Saul Alinsky, who wrote the book Rules for Radicals. As one commentator has observed, The Prince was written by Machiavelli for the haves on how to hold on to power. Rules for Radicals is written for the have-nots on how to take it away. It's Saul Alinsky who finally ties everything together for us. The introduction to his book, not the dedication as some have said, but the introduction, closes with these words, quote, "Lest we forget an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical. From all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer." End quote. The rebellion against the establishment, it's as old as the battle against God himself. When you look at it through this lens, critical theory and its family tree is simply the purest form of rebellion against God. It is rebellion against an established order that has worked for eons, and it is rebellion with no greater promise for the future than its total destruction. Rebel for no other reason than to rebel and then watch it all burn. Question everything, reject authority. The earlier quote from Herbert Marcuse, father of the New Left, sums it up nicely. Moral commands and prohibitions are no longer relevant. It truly is a war against God. The socialist fight is actually nothing less than a fight against God, country, and family, the values that Americans have held dear for so long. These are the pillars that inform and shape our culture, the culture we're in danger of losing. I said in the first video that Donald Trump's popularity among his supporters stems from the fact that we no longer trust the right or the left, the Republicans or the Democrats, to do what is best for our country. If we can't hold on to these three pillars, God, country, and family, then there is truly nothing but the fight. So if critical theory is such a big deal, then why have we not heard more about it? Well, we have, but we know it by a different name. Its child, postmodernism. Postmodernism is a broad school of thought that, like its parent, critical theory, involves a variety of disciplines. Art, music, literature, culture, philosophy, religion, they're all wrapped up in there somewhere. Postmodernism, as a form of thought, is slippery. It rejects labels and categories. The categorical thinking of the Enlightenment era, with its love for logic and reason, is not to be found in postmodernism. Instead, everything is relative. There's no such thing as an overarching narrative or history, and although many truths are to be found, truth in and of itself does not exist. Because it paints with such a broad brush, everything is wrapped up in everything else. Postmodernism views structure and category as essentially totalitarian in nature. Language, which is at the center of postmodern study, is fluid, and meaning cannot be determined simply by a single definition. Because of a lack of definitions and central narrative, there's no way to intelligently discuss ideas and arrive at any conclusion that has value or merit. In fact, the very terms value and merit are exclusive, overlooking those who have no value and no merit. And who's to determine what is valuable or meritorious anyway? And by doing so, determine what is not valuable or lacks merit. As I said earlier, the cry of postmodernism is judge not. Because of its lack of practicality, postmodernism has largely been relegated to the classroom. There's not a lot of demand in the job market for those with nebulous skills. But keep in mind that as a discipline, postmodernism focuses a lot on the written word. Therefore, it influences those in the writing disciplines, education, and the mainstream media. That's why every news broadcast seems to have an atmosphere about it of, yes, oh, but not really. Or here are the facts, but they're nothing close to the truth. And therein lies the rub. In postmodernism, even the truth is relative. So this truth is your opinion, and that truth is my opinion. And even that would be mildly acceptable if they would just go away. But remember, there's still the fight. And so your opinion must be removed, and my opinion, which is the truth, must prevail. The wolf in sheep's clothing is revealed by its arrogance and condescending nature. Postmodernism wants to be so deep, so contemplative, so profound, that it fails to realize that it's removed anything of depth, anything worth contemplating. Profundity cannot be made up in a single moment just by saying to oneself, I think I'll come up with something profound today. Great thoughts don't come that way. They come by weighing issues and grappling with truth. It's hard to grapple with truth when it doesn't exist. By embracing the question everything and reject authority mentality and coupling it all with the removal of truth and structure, all that's left is a fight that ultimately doesn't matter. A fight that will ultimately even turn on itself, the serpent eating its own tail, if you will. Ironically, this is where we are now in our country. Just ask Kanye West or the members of the #WalkAway movement. There's an old expression, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. I was not aware until doing the research for this project, but this proverb appears to transcend nationalities and ethnicities. According to the website Family Line Video, the Japanese have a corollary, rice paddies to rice paddies in 3 generations. And the Scottish say, the father buys, the son builds, the grandson sells, and his son begs. Interestingly enough, both Marx and Engels came from families that were more than well off. Most of the members of the Frankfurt School came from families that were well off. Hillary Clinton came from a family that most would describe as well off. And many of the Hollywood elites that carry the cause for socialism come from well-off families. Socialism is an interesting beast because it's comprised of bratty, angry, ungrateful children, much like those seen today on college campuses or Senate elevators, or journalists who have forgotten that their job is to report the news and not to interpret it. If you need an example of this, go to YouTube and look up media reaction to Trump win. At the end of the day, their fight has a certain Don Quixote quality. It's a fight that needs a cause for its anger, a legitimation of the need for the fight. Its indignance is matched only by its arrogance and its emptiness. Without truth and values, there is nothing but the fight. I watched a video recently of a diesel engine that had run away. This usually occurs when there's damage to the engine itself and oil goes directly into the intake. The engine, directly fueled in this manner, begins to speed up until it runs wide open. From that point, it's only a matter of time until heat and friction take their toll and the engine tears itself up from the inside out. Turning the key off will not help, nor will disconnecting the battery. The best way to stop it is to clog the intake. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, socialism, with its steady stream of hatred, bitterness, and its desire to fight, has created a situation where this country is about to tear itself apart. It's time to clog the intake and put a rag in it. I'm Ralph Williams, and that's the view from my front porch.